Turnaround Pastors webinar, and it's my delight, and it's our privilege to have Karl Vaters with us as our guest speaker. I've known Karl and his work for since his book, The Grasshopper Myth, came out. What year was that, Karl? I don't even remember now.
That was 10 years and about 6 months ago. So yeah, it was,
Okay. All right.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So I enjoyed reading Karl's work very much. We've traded an occasional comment on blog sites here and there. And if memory serves correctly, several years ago, we met briefly at a conference somewhere.
We did. I
I
can't remember
don't
where it
remember.
was either, but we have met in
Yeah,
person. Yeah.
okay. It's not so much a reflection on it wasn't great to meet you, but it's just my memory doesn't always
No,
dread
hey, me too.
it these things up. So I wanted to start off, Karl, and say that I have found your work to be refreshing and thought provoking, and you have provided, I think, a needed counterbalance or balancing weight for some of the more, shall we say, effusive expressions of the church growth movement of years gone by, and really done a great service to small churches and pastors of smaller churches, much needed to relieve them of the burden of feeling that they've got to be like big guys. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you for that. And
Thank you.
before we get into your presentation today, would you tell us a little bit about what you're working on currently and how you've come to this place in your ministry? I'll let you
Sure.
retell the grandpa story if you want, but
Sure.
tell us a little bit about what's going on and how we got to this point.
Yeah. I'll do those in reverse. How we got to this point first. Yeah. I've been pastoring for over 40 years now, and I've
Mhm.
been at my current church for over 30 years. And at about year 15 or so, I started really, I went through a very difficult season of a little bit of growth in the church, and then it collapsed again. And we couldn't seem to get through these barriers that all of the information kept telling me how to get through. And I'm usually pretty good at following directions. And I thought we were doing a pretty good job. I live in a very populated area. I live in Orange County, California, on one of the main streets that actually borders Disneyland, exactly 8 miles to the north of us. So it's a very populated
Mhm.
place. Tens of thousands of people drive by the front door of our church every single day, but we never could seem to get the growth that all of these books seemed to have promised. After going through a season of real soul searching, I started to realize, okay, I'm a small church pastor, and I have to figure out what being a small church pastor looks like, how to do it healthily, how to do it in a
Right.
way that fits the small church size. And then I looked around for resources to help me do that and could find very few. There were a couple books out at the time, but for some reason I wasn't able to find them. And so I started just putting bits and pieces together, and enough of it came together. And quite frankly, my wife got tired of me whining about not being able to find books so much that she finally looked at me and she said, "Quit whining about it and write the book." But
Tired.
I'm not going to write a book. Nobody knows me. Nobody's ever heard of me. I'm just some small church pastor. No, I don't even have any social media presence. And so she says,
Oh,
"Who else is going to write a book about small churches other than a small church pastor? And how many famous ones do you know?" Oh, okay.
mhm.
That's pretty
Okay.
compelling. So, yeah. So I
Yeah.
wrote the book and really didn't expect it to go anywhere. I thought I'm going to have hundreds of these books stacked in my garage for the rest of my life. But it started
Mhm.
selling like crazy right off the top. The blog took off like crazy right away. And it really just shows the huge need that there is and how few
Yeah.
resources there are. And so the Lord just really was in that and started helping me to do that. And so that's what I do now. I'm constantly looking for resources that are applicable specifically to the small church, that are different than what our big church friends are using. So that's how it
Mhm.
started. Current projects, actually two really big projects underway right now. On Monday, just 2 days ago, I handed in my fifth book to the editor at Moody. So that's scheduled to be out in March of 2024. The title of that
Mhm.
book, at least right now, sometimes they change, is "Desizing the Church." And the
Okay.
premise of it is that I've done some research. I asked, okay, how did we get to the point where everybody's so obsessed with everything being big in the church? And
Mhm.
it's got to come from somewhere. So I actually did a deep dive in history of the church growth movement and, as it turns out, into American history. And there are these two streams of American history and the church growth history that have combined in ways that when you read it, you go, of course, we're obsessed with bigness. This is where it comes from. So I
Mhm.
go into how we got obsessed with bigness, what this obsession with bigness has cost us, and what are some ways
Yeah.
forward out of this and which are ways to think bigger. So better than that. So that's one project is the book. And then the other project in 2024, Shelley and I are no longer going to be on staff at our church. We're actually going into this ministry full time. And in
Mhm.
2024, we're going to launch that part of our ministry by being on the road for the entire year of 2024. We're going to get in an RV and we're going to spend the entire year on the road. We're going to hit every major section of the country. We're going to be putting on pastoral events in every major section of the country. And we will be doing
Fantastic.
research about small churches as we travel so that we can get a better understanding of the current state of the small church in America. So that's the big news.
Wow. Wow. Well, you've really whetted my appetite desizing the church. That's a question that I have pondered quite a bit and looking forward to a copy of the book. When is it available?
March 2024 is the release date. Probably the end of the year, November, December, we'll start doing some promo, get a launch team going. So if anybody wants to read an advance copy, look on my social media stuff or my newsletter, and I'll be announcing when you can get an advance copy to be on the launch team and help us get the thing promoted. So that
Wonderful.
usually happens November or December for a March launch. So we'll see.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Today's topic or your presentation is about pastoring churches through turmoil, political, social, cultural, what have you. And I wanted to b- tell the audience, those that are here listening, that if you have questions for Karl as the presentation unfolds, the way that you pose those questions is over on the right-hand column of your browser screen. There are 5 icons. The second one from the top looks like a balloon, a little Pope balloon with a question mark in it. And so to pose your question, you click on that and then type in your question. And then once Carl's finished with his presentation, we'll take those questions and answer them as they come up. I see Dave Williams has already got a question for us.
I'll,
Dave,
I'll answer
please.
that. Yep. I'll answer
Okay.
that right
Yep.
up front before I do my talk. Yep.
Okay. Go ahead.
All righty. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Dave. He's asking if I have dates and places for the speaking engagements. We are putting them together now. We have 7 or 8, I believe, that are for sure in place. And off the top of my head, I can just give you general ideas. We're going to be in Mobile, Alabama. Oh, the first one's going to be here in my home church in California in January. We'll be in Mobile, Alabama in February. We will be in Florida. We're going to be doing 5 stops throughout Florida in, I think, late February. March, we're actually going to be in Europe. We've been invited to come to Germany, Austria, and Switzerland in March. April, we'll
Mhm.
be in North Carolina. May, we'll be doing a 5-stop tour through upstate New York and Pennsylvania. And then following that, in early May, I believe we're going to be on Long Island, in New York. We're going to be in
Mhm.
Flint, Michigan in June, I believe. And we're going to be in Willow Springs, Missouri in September.
Okay.
And the end of the year still isn't scheduled yet because we needed to get the front of the year set up. So probably September, we'll actually have exact dates and places and a chance for people to sign up and register for these
Mhm.
events. But that's the general out outline of it right now.
Okay. Well, Dave will probably reach out to you by email. He's the director of the Eastern Region Council Churches of God up in the Northeast. Dave himself is in Pennsylvania, and he's the shepherd of several hundred churches up there. So I understand the reason for his question. So
Yeah, well, I'll
uh,
be in Pennsylvania. Love to connect with you, Dave.
fantastic. Okay. So I'm going to mute my mic and I'll keep an eye on the questions for you. And so 1, 2, 3, go, Carl.
All righty. We're going to talk for about 20 minutes or so on this really important topic. So, pastoring the small church through social, political, and cultural conflict. If you haven't noticed yet, everybody's mad. It's a really interesting time to be pastoring a church because I've never seen a season like this in my 40 plus years of pastoral ministry where more people are angry over more things than they are right now. Some of that anger is justified and it's over very large, important issues. But anybody who's in pastoral ministry knows a whole bunch of the anger isn't particularly justified and is not over particularly big stuff. It just seems to be in the air. There's a lot of social conflict, political conflict, cultural conflict, and of course, religious conflict as well. So, what I want to do is I want to walk you through some lessons that a friend of mine really helped me with to understand how to first of all, how to understand why this feeling of conflict seems to be in the air. And secondly, how to begin to help people address it from a pastoral standpoint. We were midway through pandemic at the time. We thought we were at the end of it. Turned out it was midway through that whole situation and everybody was all stirred up. And I remembered that I had a friend named Lori Andrews, and Lori has a doctorate in education with an emphasis in neurobiology, and she also happens to be a small church pastor's wife. So she's got a very interesting resume. I thought, you know what, with her understanding of the small church and with her understanding of neurobiology, I want to talk to my friend. So I've had several conversations with Lori, and she's really helped me with some of these. As I say, a doctorate in education, emphasis in neurobiology, but she's got a Christian and a pastoral ministry back, background. Neurobiology, of course, is the understanding of how our brains physically work, which one of the things that's really interesting is the brain is the only organ in our body that does not work mechanically. Think about it. Every other organ in our body, our heart, our lungs, our fingers, our hands, they all work mechanically. The way they work is to move. Our our brain doesn't move when it works. It simply stays in place, but electricity goes like crazy through it. So our brain is a storehouse of electricity. It's basically the world's most astonishingly complicated computer, and it sits in our heads, and it adjusts to circumstances by moving energy from place to place. That is a really layperson's understanding of this ridiculously complex organism that we call our brains. So I got a hold of my friend Lori and I asked her, what's happening in this electrically and with all of our thoughts process, what's happening emotionally to us as we're going through the situations we're going through? What's going on? Why is everybody mad at each other right now? And the first question I asked her was basically, what we're going through right now, this collective trauma. And if she paused right there and went, "Oh, thank you for using the T word." And I went, "What do you mean, what T word?" She said, "Trauma." I said, "Yeah." She said, "You're the first pastor I've talked to who's recognized and acknowledged that what we're going through right now is trauma." So I said, "Okay, then maybe I'll back up. Maybe our first question should be, are we going through trauma?" And she said, "Yeah, we are all experiencing multiple levels of severe trauma right now." So, "What do you mean?" She said, "If you take a look at the last few years, you see one thing after another. We started with this pandemic comes in and it's 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And then, oh, no, maybe not. Maybe it's going to be longer than that." And then we had the racial unrest and we had all kinds of protests in the streets. And then we had this really wonderfully pleasant presidential election that we went through. And then even when the election was over, it still wasn't over. It's in some places, they still seem to be debating this election that happened a couple of years ago. And when you take a look at 2020 and 2021, there were periods of time during that when just about every week there was a traumatic event happening in our lives that any other year would have been the headline for the year, but they were one after another. So I said, so what happens in our brains when we're going through trauma like that, when we're experiencing all of these things? And she said several things to me, but the thing that really stuck out, really has helped me understand to pastor is this. She said, people in trauma can't hear explanations. People in trauma can't hear explanations. I said, okay, what do you mean by that? She said, in our brains, as I told you before, this energy is going back and forth. So the brain, when the brain faces a particular type of activity, the brain says, okay, We need more energy in a particular part of the brain that will cover that activity. So we transfer the energy from somewhere else to that part. The brain doesn't have an unlimited energy, so it has to move the energy back and forth. When you're in trauma, there's one part of the brain that shuts down completely because we basically don't need it when we're in trauma. And it goes to two other parts of the brain that we need when we're in trauma. So I said, what happens? She said, if you look at it on a brain scan, when somebody's in trauma, their logic centers go dark and their action and emotion centers light up like a Christmas tree. Just like when you're running from a bear, you don't need to think about philosophy. So our ability to think through logically on deep levels disappears when we're in trauma, and it's all action and emotion. Get me out of here, right? Because that's what's needed in the immediate moment. You may have experienced something like this even in your pastoral role if you've been with somebody whose a family member just died or who just experienced an accident or who's going through abuse or divorce or something. You can sit down with them and you can explain, okay, we need to get a hold of this person and I've contacted them and here's what the lawyer says to do, or here's what the doctor just told us. And you can walk them through all of it. They can sit there and nod. And then hours or a day later, you can come back and they'll ask you questions about that like you didn't have that conversation. And as far as they're concerned, you didn't have that conversation. Why? Because when somebody's highly traumatized, they can't hear the explanations. People in trauma literally cannot process new information because the places where they process new information go dark in order to go into the action and emotion that is required when we're in trauma. So, what happens when we're in extended trauma over long periods of time? And here's what's really interesting about what we've gone through and are still going through in the world today. This is the first time since World War II that the entire world has experienced the same trauma at the same time. There have been larger traumas since World War II. There's been genocides and wars and floods and famines. There have been horrible traumas that are far worse than what we're experiencing now. But this is the first global one since World War II, and that is not without insignificance. And it's the first time that the trauma has just continued. It's a fairly low level trauma, but it keeps going and doesn't let up. And here's what's really interesting about that. The last time we in America experienced like a major trauma together was 9/11, but that was a singular trauma. It was obvious and visible. And that night, virtually every church in America was open because people needed to get together to pray, to hug each other, just to find the comfort in gathering together and worshiping with each other, right? During these traumas, especially in the first few months of it, and for me in California, we were locked down for 6 months. The normal avenues of gathering together, of being with loved ones, of mourning at the same time in the same place with people, those avenues of healing were cut off to us in the lockdowns. So not only did we experience this trauma that didn't let up, but the normal places we go for healing were closed to us. I asked my friend, what do we need when we're in trauma? She said, people in trauma need familiarity and stability. People in trauma need familiarity and stability. They need to do familiar things in familiar places with familiar people. But especially at the beginning of the lockdowns and so on, those avenues of healing were cut off from us. And so they lingered and they locked themselves in tight. So that even after that, even after everything returned to normal and we can now go to church and go to the stores and meet with family members and do everything we have, there's a residue left over of people. I've got 3 friends who passed away during 2020 of COVID, and none of their loved ones were allowed to be with them in the hospitals as they died. That trauma will never go away. Not just the trauma of losing someone, but the trauma of having to watch it happen on Zoom rather than actually being in the room with them. That trauma will never go away. And so it's a real challenge. So we put all of that together, and here's an interesting way that it played out. In 1969, a woman named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote the book called On Death and Dying. And you may have never heard her name or the name of her book, but it doesn't matter because you know her work. Because if you've ever heard someone say, you're in denial, that's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. What Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did was that she showed us how our brains and our emotions recover from loss and trauma by going through 5 distinct stages. And most of you have heard these stages, you know them: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, right? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So what I noticed happening over the last few years was we had an initial thing. Let's go to the 2 weeks to flatten the curve. So we have the initial thing and we go through denial. Oh, that doesn't sound like enough. Okay. Maybe anger. They shouldn't be doing that. And then bargaining. Okay. Maybe I'll do that. And then it goes longer than that. And they go, oh, that doesn't seem right at all. And then we have the civil unrest. Oh, that's horrible. And then we have the election, and the election's not over. And then January the 6th. And I'm missing 10 things that happened in between those. And at a certain point, we were in all 5 stages of recovery from 10 to 15 trauma points. And at that point, the brain goes, that's it. I'm done. I'm not dealing with this anymore. I'm not recovering from anything. Now, that's all subconscious. Nobody actually sits there and goes, I refuse to recover. No, this is all subconscious. But our brain at that point goes, I can't process all of these things and all of these stages all at the same time. So what I discovered was this: everyone seems to have a default reaction to trauma. And with all of it building up, everybody picked one spot and went, okay, this is where I'm going to live. So now let me walk you through the 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I'm going to walk you through them alphabetically, because I'm going to walk you through them now, not as stages that people go through, but as defaults where people just say, I'm going to stay here for good because the processing is just too complicated. Okay. So starting with A, okay, acceptance. There are people that you know who their response to everything recently seems to have been, it is what it is. Everything works for the good, right? God's in control. And they seem fine. And then all of a sudden, they're gone from church and they don't come back. Or all of a sudden, they blow up and you can't figure out why they got mad, because they've been telling everybody everything's okay. God's got this. It is what it is. And all of a sudden, they blow up. Why? Because when you're defaulting to acceptance, what you do is you end up tamping down the trauma and not dealing with it because you want to put on the smiley face. So those are people who land in the campground of acceptance and just stay there. Next A is this: anger. You got people in your life who used to be reasonable people, and now they are angry at everything all the time. These are the ones who are like, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. And God bless them. There's plenty of fuel for that fire. There's a lot of stuff to be angry about, but not everything is worth being angry about. But for some people, they're always angry about everything. They didn't wake up one day and choose consciously to go, I am going to be an angry person from this point on. It's a reaction to trauma. They can't process through the rest of it. It's just easier to be angry than to be afraid. Okay, so anger. So acceptance, anger. The third one, B, is bargaining. These are the fixers in your church, okay? The best volunteers in my church are probably bargainers. In fact, a year or so ago, I went to a couple of them and said, I can't remember the last Sunday you were gone. You work hard every Sunday. Oh, I don't leave on Sunday. This is my therapy. This makes me feel better to work. And I said, no, you're taking the next 2 Sundays off. They got mad at me. Why are you doing that to me? I said, because I'd rather lose you for 2 weeks than lose you for good. Because if you keep working this hard for this long without a break, you're going to flame out. And I value you more than I value the time you're able to put in here. I value you as a person. You need to take a break. I'm going to bet that most of us on this call have bargaining somewhere in one of our top 2 defaults, because we're helpers. We help others. And so we end up burning ourselves out trying to change things. So acceptance, anger, bargaining. The fourth one then is denial. Okay. These are the people who are walking around going, everyone's lying. I can't trust anybody anymore at all. Except this one guy on YouTube. He's got it fixed. Let me send you the link. It's And again, these used to be reasonable people who used to think through things logically. And now it's just denying anything anybody says until the craziest thing in the world comes along. And then they accept that. What's going on here? Again, it's easier to deny the truth than it is to work through the really complicated process of it right now. Okay. And then the fifth one is depression. These are the people who just, here's the best way to describe it. Up until about 20 years ago, they used to say people have a fight or flight response to trauma. And I never thought I had either of those. I'm not a fighter, but I don't run from a problem either. And then about 20 years ago, they said, actually, it's not fight or flight, it's fight, flight, or freeze. And I went, oh, they found me. That's me. I'm deer in the headlights until I get it figured out. And then after I get it figured out, I come to you and tell you how to fix your problem. Okay. So my first default is depression. And then I go to bargaining. That's what I know about myself. So The first thing we need to do, you've been listening to this and you've probably identified several people in your congregation and your family as,
Mhm,
oh, that's so and so. Now I get it. But before you do that, do this: identify your own default, recognize your own trauma first.
mhm,
Can't help others until you recognize that. Now that I know my default is depression, and then once I figure it out, I want to go and fix everybody. Now that I know that, I can deal with it because I've made it conscious. Now I can use them as steps along the way towards getting better and towards healing rather than just as places that I'm going to live because I have some understanding of it. So here's the deal: do not go home after this to somebody who's dealing with anger or dealing with denial and going, "Hey, I got a guy who just told me you're angry and here's why." No, here's the deal. The under, you know what's beneath all of these? When somebody picks any one of these, again, subconsciously, nobody does it unconsciously. When somebody lands in one of these places that stays there, here's the reason. Every single time: fear. It's easier to just accept it than to be afraid of it. It's easier to get angry than to be afraid of it. It's easier to try to fix it than to be afraid of it. It's easier to deny that it's going on than to be afraid of it. And it's easier to just to sit there and watch TV and eat ice cream all day than it is to deal with it, get in depression, right? But don't
mhm,
address the symptom. All five of these are symptoms. Address the fear beneath the symptom. But if you recognize your own, like I have with mine, okay, and you then have a way to process it, then you can look around and go, okay, what is it that these people are afraid of? And don't even walk up to them and go, okay, you're afraid of something. Let's figure it out, because they'll be immediately on the defense. What you got to do then is sit down with people and say, hey, let's just have a conversation about how's life? How are things going? How are you feeling? And as you do it, ask them, where did that come from? Why do you think? You're just asking what seem like fairly benign questions. But eventually, if you ask enough questions and you go deep enough, at some point, somebody's going to go, yeah, it really bugged me when that happened. Why was that? I don't know. It just seems so scary that this is the direction our society's going, or whatever. Find the fear.
mhm,
There's a reason why fear not is one of the most repeated commands in scripture. Not 365 times, no matter what everybody wants to say. It's like 68 times, but nevertheless, fear not repeats a lot in scripture because it is the underlying problem to a whole lot of the way we respond
mhm.
improperly to traumatic events in our lives. So now you've got a few tools. First thing, ask yourself which one's mine, because you've got to identify your own. And here's the deal: if you look at the five and you go, I'm not any of those, welcome to denial. And if you think, you know what? No, I'm a more mature Christian than that. I don't go through that. Here's the deal: Romans 7 is Paul going through this. Romans 7 is Paul going through all kinds of things. He's being triggered by all kinds of stuff and he's trying to figure out what to do. And in the middle of this, the greatest document ever written about Christian theology, Paul has an emotional meltdown over the
Mhm.
trauma of trying to follow God and not being able to. So if
Right.
you think this doesn't apply to you, you're telling yourself you're more mature in your faith than the apostle Paul was while writing Romans. Get over yourself. All right. So there we go. That's some of it there. I hope some of that helps you a little bit, and we'll do some Q&A now.
Yeah. Carl, I was captivated by your quote from your neurobiologist friend, lady friend, that people in trauma cannot hear explanations. And the reason that resonated with me is one of the things that at Turnaround Pastors Ministry we try to do is help pastors to become change agents. And we have found that grief is actually the first stage of beneficial change in a church.
Mm.
People have to grieve what they are losing.
Yep.
And so we teach the ministry of presence. But so that's the setup to a question that I really want to ask. And that is, do you think or have you seen that these five stages not only characterize individuals, but whole churches? And what's behind that question is we work with a number of churches in different parts of the country. They tend to be smaller congregations. And from time to time, we work with pastors that give the sense that their church is stuck in depression. And the way that it manifests for these pastors, the way they experience is passivity. by the congregation. People are no longer manifesting the same sense of zeal for the work of the Lord or the fellowship of the saint. They become irregular in church attendance, unreliable in fulfilling commitments. So, is it possible, or maybe I'm going down a rabbit hole, that maybe these 5 stages characterize whole churches as well? And if
Yeah,
so, then what would be a good intervention for a pastor of a church that has become passive and unresponsive, in
that's
denial?
yeah, that is a really great observation and a really good question that I have not considered before, but my gut says yes. Because as you're describing and as I'm thinking through different churches in different stages of ill health, yeah, I can identify the church that's in depression. I can see the church that's in denial, the church that's in anger.
Mhm,
Yeah, the anger one is pretty obvious in a whole bunch of places. But yeah, I absolutely believe that's the case. There can be collective trauma.
mhm,
And I think it's more applicable probably in smaller churches simply because people actually know each other. And so they
mhm,
feed off each other's emotional states and they've got deep history with each other. Usually in larger churches, people don't know each other as well. And it's more event based than relationally based. And so as long as the events keep going, it seems like it's okay. But I don't think it is unapplicable to big churches. I just don't think it applies quite as often there. But yeah, I
mhm,
absolutely believe that that's the case. And if that's the case, then I think step number one is recognizing that, okay, we are a church that right now is in a state of depression or we're in a state of denial. We're not even recognizing that we have these issues and we've got to recognize that we have these issues. Or why are we constantly bringing in new programs and this program will fix it and that didn't work, this program will fix it, no, that didn't work. Maybe because you're in a bargaining mode and you need to acknowledge that, wait a minute, the bargaining comes from fear. What is it that we're afraid of that we think all of these programs are going to fix? And instead of trying to fix it program wise, let's ask ourselves, let's look at the entire set of stages. What have we denied? What are we trying to fix? Let's walk through these stages together and get to a place of health. Because every one of these has scriptural applications. Every one of these steps, you can find episodes in biblical characters' lives where they were going through these seasons and the Lord brought them out. So it's
mhm.
greatly biblical applicable because it does describe how God made our brains to recover. So that's something I need to think more about and research more into, but that's my gut.
Okay. Now I realize I'm asking you to riff here, impromptu, but if we accept the premise that there are churches where everybody's stuck in a particular stage, and we'll go back to the passive church where depression or deer in the headlights seems to be the response. Any thoughts off the top of your head? Any interventions in addition to addressing the issue directly that you'd suggest maybe the pastors could put to good use? How would you go about tackling that passive church where everybody seemed to be just kind of withdrawn or depressed or deer in the headlights?
Yeah, anytime a church is in that place of passivity, I think we need to remind them of the mission and not just remind them by preaching, but actually activate them into the mission.
Hmm.
And the first steps to those, I always love the idea of the early easy win. You want to so you're not just teaching on, hey, we got to get more active. You got to give them a project. Here's something we can do together. But don't start with, we got to get everybody in my entire community saved. No, or we've got to witness to 100 people this week. These are big things that we'll eventually get to, but start with something simple. I just recently discovered, and in fact, I put it in my new book. There's been some studies done that show that the best behavior that identifies spiritual maturity is how often we read our Bible. And it's a really interesting thing. They actually call it the power of four. And what they've discovered is people who read their Bible once or twice a week are more mature than people who don't read it at all. 3 times a week, a little more mature. But then there's a huge jump when you jump from 3 to 4. People
Mm,
who read their Bibles 1 or 2 or even 3 times a week have slightly better discipleship behaviors than people who don't read the Bible at all. But people who read the Bible 4 or more times per week are significantly higher in their spiritual maturity than those who don't. I think it's
Mhm.
because at 4, you're reading the Bible more times a day than you're not reading the Bible. The
Mhm.
Bible reading days now are a majority in your life, and I think there's something about that. So if that's the case, why don't we present that? People love to have a contest. People love to have a goal that they can reach. So why don't you present it? Present that idea and go, hey, here's what the research shows. They call it the power of 4. And I can, because I'm riffing, like you said, I can find that later and send you that information so you can send it out to everybody. But like, you know, because that's the case, what if we said, hey, here's what happens. Why don't we make it a goal that in the next 6 months, we're going to become better Bible readers and we're all going to hit a minimum of 4 times per week? And maybe you put a survey out there and you hand them out just a little piece of paper that says, how many times do you read the Bible a week currently? One, two, three, four, five, six, or seven. Be honest. Let's put a zero on there as well, right?
Mhm.
If I could add that to the book, it just occurred to me I didn't put a zero on the card in the book. Right. And then you collect those. And the next week you report and you go, 14% of us don't read the Bible at all. And 17% of us read the Bible once a week. And you put it up on the screen. It's all anonymous. It's just numbers, right? Let's see if
Mhm.
how many we can get up to 4 and above in the next 6 months. And now here's a Bible reading program you can read online. Here's a through the Bible plan that we're going to do that you can get in the lobby. Let's read that together. And every week you remind people, if you've been reading your Bible this week, take the survey again 6 months or a year down the road and see, did we hit those goals? How much are we getting our Bible reading up? It's a starting point. It's not obviously simply reading the Bible for a contest of sorts is not
Right.
the key that will unlock spiritual maturity in your church, but it's a good start. Good
Yeah.
start. Something like that would be my suggestion.
You're urging them to step into their role as pastors to actually start discipling their peoples in a really crucial spiritual discipline.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and
And in
there's
a
a
very practical way that has evidence that it has practical real world results.
yeah, just one comment on that, and then we'll move on to Gary's question. I'm also aware of research that's been done that demonstrates that when pastors are deliberate in training their people in the spiritual disciplines, those people are far more likely, in a statistically significant way, to spontaneously engage in personal evangelism without having been told that they need to do that.
Yep. Yep.
That's
Yep.
it.
I just found the link and I just put it in the comments there.
Oh,
It's a
good. Okay.
PDF. Yep. It's a PDF file. So you can grab that and look it up for
Wonderful.
yourself. It's a very scholarly piece of work. It was done 7 or 8 years ago, I believe, but it's got some real heft to
Huh?
it.
Fantastic. We've got a question here from Gary Armstrong, a friend of mine. Gary's in the Dallas Fort Worth area, pastoring a good church over there. And his question is about when it comes to discerning which of those stages of grief the church is in, or when you're dealing with trauma victims, who does the assessing, who discern what stage or stages the trauma victim or the church is in? Is it pastor, or is it church, or is it the individuals themselves?
Yeah, great question. First of all, self-diagnosis is likely to be incorrect. That's just especially when you're in trauma, you can't self-diagnose. You can't process that logic. So you need someone who is close enough to you and has enough expertise in this that they can help you. As a pastor with individuals, my guess is especially in a smaller congregation, you're going to know the person, you're going to see that. And so you might have been able to make an assessment yourself and then start to sit down with conversations. Again, you're getting around the back door to find the fear. Or you may have had somebody in the congregation come to you and say, hey, my husband, my wife, my kids, my parents are this. And so somebody else in their life will have recognized that and you can help with that. If it's severe uh, and more than just simply, I feel bad because of the arguments I've had over the last couple of years. If it's abuse, if it's divorce recovery, if it's serious addictions and so on, we need the people in our lives who have expertise in this, who we can then go to and recommend that they go to. We all as pastors need to understand our limitations and not try to do things that we're not trained for because we can actually cause more damage. So in most surface level traumas, we can do pastoral ministry and help them with that. in deeper ones, we need to recommend others. For churches, just like a person cannot self-diagnose, I don't believe a church can self-diagnose. So you need
Hmm.
someone like Bud or somebody else who does this kind of work, who can step in and give you, and it needs to be someone who knows churches well enough and has an expertise in that and a concern about it, that they will lead you down some good paths rather than some wrong paths. So they need to have a good scriptural understanding. They need to have some track record in doing this. And they need to be able to spend the appropriate amount of time with you and your church to get an accurate diagnosis of where you are right now. Every once in a while, I'll have somebody email me or have a short conversation with me. And in a short email or in 10 minutes, they ask me, so how do I fix my church? And I just go, I do not have enough information to tell you how to fix your church. And if I tried to tell you right now, I would probably give you bad information. I can give you general ideas about churches, read my blogs, listen to the podcast, but I'm not going to step into the specifics until I have a lot more information than that. And I don't do that kind of coaching. I don't have the time for that, but there are a lot of folks who do. So find someone who can help. I see Bud's name, but not his video anymore. So is he? Have we lost him? Ah, his feed is frozen. He says so. We'll make a moment for Bud's feed to come back up. Like he mentioned earlier, I think before everybody got on, that where he lives in Southern Arizona, his feed is not always all that reliable. And you guys may have experienced that before. So we'll wait for him. I see a little thank you from Gary. So it looks like that was a little bit helpful to you. Grateful for that, Gary. Thank you. While we're waiting on Bud, did anybody respond to those 5 stages of trauma recovery and go, oh yeah, that's me? And if so, put it in the comments. Which one is your default? If you recognized it right away, put it in the comments there. And we'll get that going while we're waiting on Bud. Do any, or are we all in denial? We're not going to admit it. There we go. Default to depression. I fight for a time, get overwhelmed, and want to fly. Hey, I hear that. I freeze in place, man. I sit and I eat too much and watch too much TV, and I can't even, I can't even read, which I love to do because my brain won't process it. So it's got to be completely passive input for me when I'm in those places of trauma. My depression gets fairly deep. I've never been clinically diagnosed with that, but yeah. All righty, here we go. And now, how do you reconcile smallness and the Great Depression? Oh, and we got another one here from Dave. Acceptance is my default. I appreciate the freeze thought as well. That's where I often go. Yeah, I hear you. So, from Gordon, how do you reconcile smallness and the Great Commission? Great question. Here's how I reconcile it. I don't want churches to be small. I want small churches to be great. And if we can encourage small churches to be great and to respond to the Great Commission and the Great Commandment and to make disciples, then we will be fulfilling our part of the Great Commission. I think sometimes we default to, we are in America, especially, and this is part of what I'll address in the next book. In America, especially, we approach our faith in such an individualistic way. We do so as people, as individuals, and we read the book through an individualistic lens, right? The promises, for instance, or we read about the promises to Israel and even the curses to Israel, or the promises to the church, or the way the church is to behave. And we read it almost exclusively individualistically. I should do this. And that's part of it. But most of the Bible is written to groups, to the Jewish people in the Old Testament, to the church in the New Testament. And it is to be done as a group of people. We're to live our lives collectively. Okay. So the body of Christ, for instance, Paul uses the body analogy in First Corinthians, right? And he says, some of us are a hand, some of us are an eye, some of us are a foot, and we shouldn't despise our role, and we shouldn't look down at somebody else's role and despise their role either. So as a small church, I have my part to play in the body of Christ and in the Great Commission. And I'm going to do the part that I'm called to play as best I can at my current size. If I'm a small church, I may not be a hand in the body of Christ. I may be the fingernail on the left pinky finger. That might be my role in the body of Christ. I'm going to be the best left pinky fingernail you ever saw, because that's what God has called us to do. And not be upset that I can't be the full hand, but do the left pinky fingernail to the best of God's ability in me that I possibly can. So that, I think, is how the small relates to the Great Commission. It's not about doing less. It's about fulfilling the role that we're called to fulfill, and knowing that God has other parts of his body that are doing other things. It's not all on me. Alrighty. Welcome back, Bud. To think you're back. And Bud says his is bargaining. Got to get to work and fix this. Yeah, like I said, I think we got a lot of bargainers in the room. That tends to be how it is in a room full of pastors. I'm not hearing from Bud. Your mute is on. So if you're talking, we're not hearing you. Gary says, so for my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome, Romans 1:15. And I hope that answer to your question worked for you, Gordon. Yeah, for my part, exactly. We each have our own parts to play. And again, the individualization of the faith, particularly in America, my church has to be the answer for everybody. No, it doesn't. Play your part. And Jesus said he'll build this church. He didn't command us to. And I'm grateful for that reality every single day. It's not on me. All right. We're still waiting on Bud. How are we, Bud? Where are we? And okay, there we go. Here comes somebody.
Yeah, this is Gordy, and we're on the same team. If
Oh,
you
gotcha.
can't join you, maybe I can do some things. But
All right.
great presentation, Carl.
Thank you.
It was very well done. Very well done. Yeah, I read the grasshopper myth. I didn't like it particularly because and the reason being is I'm very much Great Commission driven, and I don't want people to have excuses for not
Yep.
engaging in the ministry the way that they should.
Absolutely.
And here's how you answered my question very well.
Thank you. Yeah, it is legitimately my only two concerns. I have two concerns that are always uppermost in my mind in this ministry. Concern number one is that I would never be in any way offering excuses. And so whenever I write, I always make that clear. The second concern is that I would in any way cause further division in the body of Christ along big and small lines, because it's not like we don't have enough divisions already. I don't want to feed that division either. So yeah, that is a legitimate concern. I understand the reason for your question because it is my concern as well. Yeah.
All right, great presentation. Are there any other questions that you'd like to ask? Or do you want to put your default style down? I looked at mine and my acceptance, and probably,
Bud's back and he's echoing. There we go.
okay, good. I'll let
Yeah.
Mentioned before that I have.
Bud, I'm not sure what's happening, but you're echoing like easy.
Okay. Yeah, it's because I opened up another browser session.
Oh, there we go.
Apologize. Yeah, when the bird flies past the transmission line out here, that's when my internet goes down. So I texted Gordon and asked if he still had the feed. Been able to follow the chat window.
Okay. Actually, in Arizona, it's probably not a bird flying by. It's probably a roadrunner running by, and it's that coyote who causes the problem.
Yeah. Let's see, there's a couple more questions that we have posed here. And one is, can a church grow in spite of these issues or in spite of other issues? Ken, if you want to text message us here in the chat window, I'll be happy to clarify. But let me turn that over to Carl. And are these issues showstoppers?
Yes and no. Can you grow in spite of the issues? Not really. You do have to resolve them. Will all the issues ever be resolved? No. So you are always going to move forward imperfectly. There will always be some issues that you're working on, but there are some issues that are big enough that no, you really can't move forward until you resolve them. And so always have to be in a place of resolving these issues, but you don't have to be under the burden of until we get everything completely fixed and perfect, we can't move forward, because then nobody would ever move forward at any time in any place. So yeah, you have to be in resolving mode at least. And certain ones, especially if they are historically deep, or if they involve a significant sin, or if they are causing a large enough disunity, if they're big enough in any way, some of them do have to get to certain points of resolution before you can unstick that and get it moving again. But you'll never get to the point of perfection. So we're always moving ahead in spite of some kinds of imperfections.
Ministry is solving one problem after another, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Another follow-up question from Gary Armstrong, and that is, Carl, which of your two books would you recommend to read first, Essentials or 100 Days?
Oh, really? Yeah. There are actually 4 of them so far, so I'll walk you through each what the 4 would be. If the pastor is feeling discouraged, isn't sure that the small churches can even be valuable, wondering why the church hasn't grown, some grasshopper myth is the place to start that will encourage you. If you are at a point where, yeah, our church is small, but I need to figure out some small church specific practical tools to get us moving forward. I need to know how to pastor a small church differently than a big church. Small church essentials is your answer. If you are in a church where things are going well, or maybe even not, but you want to get one step healthier, 100 days to a healthier church is a very intensive process that you walk through together in 100 days to help a church get one step healthier than you are right now. Either a healthier church gets one step healthier, or an unhealthy church can maybe start to turn around towards health. So if you're a place of that. And then the fourth one, church recovery guide, if your church has just gone through a crisis and is now trying to figure out how to recover from a time of crisis, the church recovery guide will help you with that.
Fantastic. I did have a question I wanted to throw up there. We've got about 8 or 10 minutes left here. Those of you in the audience, still plenty of time for questions. But one of the, I'm wondering if our training as pastors, emphasizing preaching and teaching skills, perhaps doesn't handicap us in dealing with some of these issues. When you're dealing with people in grief, going back to the quote, people in trauma can't hear explanations. Do we sometimes shoot ourselves in the foot by making a sermon or a Bible study lesson our go-to in dealing with these issues?
Yeah. Yeah, we do. I, my, my podcast is entitled The Church Lobby. It used to
Mm.
be called "Can This Work in a Small Church?" And because that was what we were doing, trying to fix small church problems. It's still small church oriented, but I changed it in the last 6 months to the church lobby for this particular
Mm.
reason. Most of us have been trained very well on how to do a stage presentation, how to present to a crowd, how to teach, how to preach, how to counsel. But we have not been purposefully trained in how to have these conversations that happen in the church lobby. And here's the thing, as church attendance continues to drop, and as some people are replacing that with online attendance, if you're going to get people to stop watching church online and come in person instead, when they leave, they have to go, I'm so glad I came in person. I could not have gotten that online. Now, here's the deal. What can they get in your church in person that they can't get online? First of all, it's not on stage. Everything you do on stage, they can get online. There's no reason for them not just to leave their house, but to get out of their bed if all they're going to get is what you present on stage. They can get that online, either from your church or from another church, and maybe even better, somewhere else, from the preaching to the music to whatever.
Mm.
Okay. So the only thing that is different in person is not what's on stage, but what's in the lobby, the conversations they have. And in a small church, especially, the first reason people choose to go to a small church instead of a big church, the number one reason they give is this: the pastor knows my name. So
Yeah.
the quality in a big church is going to be present on the stage. The quality in a small church is going to be present in the lobby. And that's going to be especially, but not entirely, about the pastoral presence in the lobby. So we need to get better at the church lobby skill set than what most of us have been trained to do.
Wow. Wow. We're coming up on the end of our time together. I wanted to ask one last question, Karl, that is related to the fact that we still live in the midst of cultural and political turmoil. Is there anything that pastors can do proactively or peremptorily to help prepare the church for the traumas that are coming our way? Because it looks like there's not going to be any end in sight in the near future. The upcoming political season looks to be more divisive and hostile than ever. The cultural and social issues seem to be highly corrosive. In addition to dealing with what we've been past, what can we do to maybe attenuate some of the trauma that is headed our way?
Yep. It's a great question. Discipleship fixes everything.
Yeah.
Pause and think through that for a moment. I dare you to come up with a problem in the church that discipleship doesn't fix. Immorality, discipleship fixes it. Immaturity, discipleship fixes it. Disunity, discipleship fixes it. Lack of evangelism, discipleship fixes it. Not knowing how to respond properly to the cultural moment, discipleship fixes it. The only thing discipleship is not designed to fix is the size of your church. Because the size of your church is not a problem to be fixed, first of all. In some situations, discipleship may actually give you a blessed exodus for a while if people have been coming for a show and don't want to be challenged. So, disciple. And here's one of the keys that we often miss in discipleship. We get people through classes and we think we've discipled them. People are always asking me, what's a good discipleship curriculum? And my answer is whatever works for you is fine, but make sure that your discipleship is built around relationship. If it's only a class, if relationship isn't at the center of it, it's not discipleship, it's just teaching. You can
More
only have
information.
discipleship if it's built, if it's built around relationship. Now you add the information to that, you can add curriculum to it, that's for sure. But if it's not built around relationship, it's not discipleship. So relationally based discipleship is the key for all of it. And it's what Jesus told us to do. He didn't say make converts. He didn't even say plant churches. He said make disciples.
Fantastic. Karl, I want to thank you on behalf of everybody that's had the opportunity to sit and hear you and those that will catch this recording later. We really appreciate your generosity of time and the work that you're doing. We're cheering you on, praying for you, and really
Thank you.
looking forward to seeing how God uses the work that you're doing in the future. So,
Thank you. I appreciate
any
it.
last comment or benediction you want to give to those that are sitting in on this session?
No, just thank you for the faithful work you do. I know that pastoring a small church, especially, can feel really challenging. And at times you can feel like, what am I doing wrong? But let me just encourage you with this. Pastoring a small church is not a penalty for doing something wrong. You've got to stop treating it as it is because it's not a penalty for doing something wrong. It's a specialty and it's worth doing well. So I pray that God will help you as you engage in this special calling of pastoring small churches. Thanks.
Thanks so much for those words. God bless you, Karl, and look forward to connecting with you again in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Bye bye now.